Hello and welcome to NewsClick. President Obama is well into his second term, given the momentum carrying on from the first, and he's right now busy setting up his new team. To discuss the foreign policy initiatives and what lies in store for Obama's second term, we have with us today Vijay Prashad.
Thanks.
Welcome, Vijay, to
Thank
NewsClick.
you.
So let me start by asking you, President Obama is now putting together his team. It's not got through the confirmation proceedings yet, but I think we're getting an idea of who is where.
Right.
So could you give us an idea of the key positions that Obama has picked and what are the implications of some of those?
See, when Obama came to power in 2009, there was a very strong section of the liberal establishment and also the liberal constituency that backed Obama. They felt that he was going to come into office, he was going to do some transformational things. You know, for instance, he had promised to shut down Guantanamo. He had promised to end the war in Iraq, which he had himself called an unnecessary war in 2002 and in 2003. He had promised to somehow draw down or reconfigure the war on terror. So he had come with huge expectations, even expectations around Iran. You know, he had talked about the need to have open hand with Iran, negotiations without any kind of, any expectations really, any demands on the table. So he had come with all these sort of very liberal provisions on the table. Now, as the Obama presidency evolved in the first term, what one began to see was what you might consider to be an emergent Obama doctrine. So the first thing that happens is, not by his own fault alone, but he could not close down Guantanamo. Recognizing that there was a problem in the way in which the war on terror was being prosecuted, in other words, capturing the so-called bad guys around the planet and then bringing them into a state of limbo where they couldn't be tried, recognizing that there was no international law provision where they were going to be able to get around dealing with these populations they were going to capture, Obama seizes upon the drone program. So now instead of capturing somebody in Yemen, you just kill them in Yemen. Instead of capturing them, in Somalia, you kill them in Somalia. Instead of capturing them in Afghanistan, you kill them in Afghanistan.
You're talking about the drone campaigns and the strikes.
Precisely. Extrajudicial assassination was much easier than increasing the size of Guantanamo. So that was one aspect of the Obama doctrine. On Iraq, for instance, one of the great things that misleads people is the assumption that the United States withdrew from Iraq by its own timetable. Actually, the Iraqi parliament voted to not allow American troops to have extraterritorial protection. They'd have to come under Iraqi law. So the Americans left. And that's an important distinction. So he didn't technically remove the Americans from Iraq. They had to leave. On Afghanistan, his entire program is now around the use of special forces, drones, night raids, mechanisms of surveillance and suppression of the population. This is the Obama doctrine. And what he's done now in the early days of what is going to be his second term is he's assembled a foreign policy team. The team will be led essentially by two important secretaries, the Secretary of State, which will be John Kerry most likely, Democrat from Massachusetts. The Secretary of Defense will be Chuck Hagel, Republican from Nebraska. And then the third person who will be essentially his person will be John Brennan, who was his counterterrorism chief and now will head the CIA. This team is an appropriate team for the Obama doctrine. It's a natural fit. And I think there's some misconceptions about the record of these three people, which has created a political debate in the United States. But that political debate is misconstrued. That is more about the deeply partisan political environment in the United States than about the actual views of these three men.
Could I just ask you to explain or elaborate on that a little bit, because not many viewers would be familiar with the personalities involved and their backgrounds. Let's take John Kerry first. He was, of course, the former presidential candidate.
Correct.
Who did not win. He was assailed on a variety of counts by the then Republican campaign. What is his record in terms of foreign policy? Because he comes with something of a reputation.
Yes. Yes, I mean, John Kerry is an interesting man. There's no doubt about it. You know, he was an important veteran after his service in Vietnam. In other words, in Vietnam, he earned 2 Purple Hearts. So he had credibility. He joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War as soon as he returned to the United States. It was about a 20,000 veteran organization. He testified before Congress, essentially in an interview of Meet the Press on the NBC News channel in 1971. John Kerry said the way the war had been prosecuted opened up the leadership to war crimes charges. You know, very serious things came out of his mouth. That was in 1971. Over the course of the 40 years since then, he's obviously moved far away from those positions. He has a reputation of being a pragmatist, but a pragmatist in a context where the politics is to the right means your pragmatism is also to the right. You know, pragmatism relies on the general needle of political, of the political culture. If it tends to the right, your pragmatism tends rightward. On the other hand, the WikiLeaks cable cache reveals an interesting person. So, for instance, he goes to the Emir of Qatar in 2010 and tells the Emir of Qatar that the United States is willing to go for a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. When these were revealed, there was just, pandemonium in Israel, a lot of anger. How could you give East Jerusalem to the Palestinians? So on the side, this guy is a skilled negotiator. There's no question about that. But as far as the main issues are concerned, drones, strangulation of Iran, prosecuting the war on terror regardless of humanitarian law, regardless of international laws of war, Mr. Kerry is 100% along the grain of Obama, and in fact will be a very effective Secretary of State for this Obama doctrine.
Can we read something into the fact that when relations between Pakistan and the United States went south immediately after the killing of Osama bin Laden inside Pakistan, it was John Kerry who was sent to Islamabad to smoothen relations, but who essentially went there to read out a rather tough message to the Pakistanis.
Well, if you look again at the WikiLeaks cables, which gives us the best indicator of what is said in public and what is said in private. I mean, he goes to Syria in 2009 and makes all kinds of statements privately to the vice president in Syria about, a peace agreement and what would Syria's role be if Israel and Palestine, what does Syria want? Very concessionary statements in private. In public, much stronger position. I mean, that's John Kerry in a nutshell. He must have come to Pakistan just to extrapolate. He would have come to Islamabad, he would have sat down with Kayani, with the generals, he would have said, how do we make it easier for you to survive? He would have told Zardari, we're on your side, and then in public, he would have made a tough position. That's John Kerry to a T. In other words, an effective American Secretary of State, in private, willing to, as it was, seduce the local ruling elites, and in public coming out as tough, and that's what Hillary Clinton has been doing. That's what John Kerry would do.
If we turn to Chuck Hagel, who is the nominee now, the putative nominee for Defense Secretary, he also has a similar background to John Kerry's. He is also a former soldier, much decorated. He's also on record saying, the last thing I would ever want is a war anywhere, because it's the nastiest thing to happen. So how do you think he fits in with the what you call the new Obama doctrine as Defense Secretary?
Right. I mean, they're parallel people. They come from different classes, but they're parallel people. Chuck Hagel enlisted in the army, goes to Vietnam, wins also 2 Purple Hearts, returns to the United States with those 2 Purple Hearts, but he doesn't become an anti-war activist. He is not an anti-war activist. Chuck Hagel will return to the United States. For about 30 years, he keeps those politics under wraps. You know, he becomes an important figure in Nebraska politics, a very conservative state. It's the Iraq War that actually brings this new Chuck Hagel into the public domain. Both Kerry and Hagel voted to authorize George Bush to begin the war in Iraq. Shortly after the war began, and when it became clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that this was going to be a very chaotic, very bloody situation, Kerry turned against the war and Hagel turned against the war. And it's at that point that Hagel starts to talk about the problems of war, the problems of authorization, and he starts also to question the firm hold that Israel's foreign policy needs have on American foreign policy making. And that critique is quite significant, but from the early 2000s, when he starts to enunciate that critique, to the end of 2012, even Hagel makes a journey, you know, so that during this period, Hagel will criticize Israel. Hagel will criticize the strong sanctions against Iran. You know, he'll say there's no need for unilateral sanctions. The United States should just pursue UN sanctions. You know, the United States currently has sanctions that are much greater than the UN sanctions. So that was his position over the decade from the Iraq war till 2012. Surprisingly, in the fall of 2012, in the autumn of 2012, he begins to return to a different kind of view. So he wrote a piece jointly authored in the Washington Post where he called for tough sanctions on Iran, and he said we have to keep military strikes as an option. You know, coming back, as it were, to the classic Obama position. Tough sanctions, you know, underneath that covert war, and, you know, at the back of everybody's mind, the threat of a military strike.
Two quick questions. To clarify for our viewers, it's reported in the American press that Chuck Hagel would face as much opposition from the Republicans as he would from anyone else. Well, how does one understand that?
Well, I mean, the American political scene is a toxic political scene. You know, it's deeply polarized. And maybe the polarization, some people liken it to kabuki theater. It's not real. You know, this is a game of shadows that are being played. You know, that's one way to go. The other is that there is a strong Israel lobby, as everybody knows, and Hagel himself has criticized the role of the Israel lobby in Washington, D.C. So, because in Hagel's record over the last 10 years, he's made statements that don't call for the United States to break its ties with Israel. All he says is the United States, if it is to be seen as a balanced operator in the region, must take a balanced position vis-a-vis the Palestinians and Israel. You know, he's not saying let's move the needle into a pro-Palestinian direction. All he's saying is, look, it's right there at the pro-Israel point, let's try to bring it back up to zero. That's all he said. The Israel lobby, I think, every once in a while needs to exercise its will. And it has come hard. It's pushed several of the Republicans, you know, the senators in particular, to speak out against Hagel. And this has brought, you know, the liberal Zionist section out saying, look, you know, he's not bad at all. He's not an anti-Semite. He's not anti-Israel. So that's one part of the debate, you know, and it's not a serious issue at all. It's very likely that Chuck Hagel, who has lots of friends in the Republican Party, is going to be, you know, confirmed as the defense secretary. And it's important to remember that for several presidents, it has become a convention to have at least one person from the opposing party in your cabinet.
And he would be the second defense secretary that Obama has had from the Republican
Precisely. And there's no difference between Bob Gates, the previous defense secretary, and you know, and Mr. Hagel. In between them was Leon Panetta, who, you know, was an interregnum, never really put out a proper articulation of his views. But if you look at the views of Robert Gates and you look at the views of Chuck Hagel, there is no difference. They were both, in a sense, perfect candidates to help propel this new emergent Obama doctrine.
Which is, would it be right to characterize this as, you called it, a new pragmatism or a pragmatism of the right? Would it be correct to characterize this as a new center-right emerging in US politics?
I mean, it's hard to say that, Raghu, because the issue is American domestic politics is really so fragmented that to talk about any center force developing is very, I think, would be optimistic. Right. It's a place where there are two different competing forces, institutions rather, where there's more shared between them in terms of ideology than distinguishes them. So there's a natural center-right constituency. The issue is during the Bush administration, it was skewed a little further to the right, that it looked like there was a real right and that there therefore may be a liberal section. What the Obama administration has done is return things to the natural posture of American foreign policy, which is a rightist foreign policy, which has a temperamental outlook towards issues like, say, human rights, etc. That's the rhetoric of American foreign policy.
In conclusion, how do you see the first term of the Obama presidency and the second term? Do you see more continuity or some departure?
Well, just to take the simple position is he's going to have many fewer women in the second cabinet, and a lot of people are very angry about this because, he mocked Mitt Romney during the campaign when Romney said, I have binders full of women.
Now people are saying that they should give Obama some binders full of women.
Exactly. There may be no women in his cabinet in senior positions. It's a serious issue, for a presidency committed to feminism, committed to women's rights. It demonstrates that that commitment might be simply, again, rhetorical or to continue to maintain dominance over a constituency. So that's one issue. There will be a change. I don't think there's going to be much change. Obama temperamentally is not a progressive. He is somebody who I think would like to have a rational foreign policy, but it's a rational foreign policy for a retooled push around the world. American primacy has suffered a lot of setbacks, and I think they, during the Obama presidency, have been trying to recover ground, both ideological ground and also, of course, in terms of its rebuilding its client-state relationships around the planet.
You use the term retooled, which I think is very interesting because from all that one reads, there is going to be some fairly substantial cuts in defense expenditure. And part at least of the drone strategy is a way of coping with a reduced heavy armament infrastructure, but still allowing you a way to prosecute your military strategy. Thank you very much, Vijay, for this discussion.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot.